They thought tearing down my ranch's bridge would pressure me into obeying their HOA, but what they never understood was that the bridge wasn't some optional structure or cosmetic feature. It was the backbone of a working ranch that had existed long before their manicured lawns, matching fences, and laminated rulebooks ever appeared in this area. And to understand how badly they miscalculated, you have to understand the land itself. Because this ranch wasn't an investment property or weekend escape, it was a living operation that functioned every single day, with cattle, rotations, feed deliveries, equipment, transport, veterinary access, and seasonal labor, all depending on access routes that had been planned and refined over decades. And along the eastern edge of the property ran a wide, shallow creek that looked harmless to anyone unfamiliar with agricultural land, but became impassable during heavy rain, which is why my grandfather, who built this ranch with his own hands, constructed a reinforced wooden bridge there many years ago, not for aesthetics or convenience, but purely for function, engineered to handle tractors, trucks, and herds without fail. And that bridge had stood through storms, floods, inspections, and time itself without incident, without complaints, without scrutiny, until a luxury housing development appeared downstream and brought with it the kind of homeowners association that believes authority expands the moment their property line ends. And at first, their presence barely affected us, because ranch life teaches you to focus on your work in mind, your own business. But slowly and predictably the complaints began to surface. First, casual comments about dust drifting toward their homes. Then written notices about early morning equipment noise, followed by complaints about livestock smells, workers using nearby roads, and vague accusations that ranch activity was lowering their quality of life. And I ignored most of it because ranches don't move, and developments do. And anyone who chose to buy a house next to active agricultural land knew exactly what they were signing up for. But eventually, the bridge became their fixation, labeled an eyesore, a safety hazard, and a liability risk, even though it was fully on my land, served no one but the ranch, and predated every single house in their neighborhood. And when the HOA formally demanded that I remove or replace it with a modern structure that matched their architectural standards, I laughed at first, because the idea that an HOA could dictate infrastructure on private agricultural land was absurd. But HOAs don't respond to logic, they respond to resistance. And my refusal only triggered escalation. Formal letters arrived threatening fines, legal action, and references to safety codes that didn't apply. And when I finally hired a lawyer to shut the situation down, he reviewed everything carefully and told me in very clear terms that the HOA had absolutely no jurisdiction over the bridge, no authority to demand changes, and no legal mechanism to enforce compliance. And for a brief moment, I believed that would be the end of it, because even the most arrogant HOA usually backs down when faced with reality. But arrogance has a way of overriding common sense. And one morning, earlier than usual, I drove out to check on the ranch and immediately sensed something was wrong. Because the familiar crossing point looked chaotic. Deep tire tracks cut through the mud. Broken beams were scattered along the creek. Planks floated in the water. And where the bridge had always been, there was nothing. No structure, no crossing, just destruction. And for a few seconds my brain refused to process it, because it felt impossible that someone would simply remove a bridge without permission, without notice, without authority. But then I saw the trucks, the heavy equipment, and the workers still on site, wearing contractor vests, marked with the HOAS logo. And when I confronted them, demanding to know who authorized this, they told me calmly that the HOA board had voted to remove the bridge for safety reasons, as if a vote replaced property law. And when I asked under what permit or court order they were operating, they shrugged and said they were following HOA instructions. And in that moment, it became clear that this wasn't a misunderstanding or mistake. It was a deliberate power move meant to show me that they believed they could physically enforce their will. The realization hit hard that morning that the HOA hadn't just crossed a line, they had erased it entirely. Because destroying a bridge isn't a paperwork dispute or a zoning argument. It's physical interference with private land. And the consequences started unfolding immediately. Because without that bridge, the ranch didn't just become inconvenient to operate, it became vulnerable. Equipment routes that had been used safely for years were suddenly cut off, forcing heavy machinery to take longer, rougher paths that increased wear and risk. Livestock movements that were normally controlled and predictable had to be rerouted through temporary crossings that were never designed for daily use. Feed deliveries were delayed because trucks couldn't reach certain areas without detouring miles out of the way. And emergency access became a serious concern. Because if a vehicle couldn't cross quickly in normal conditions, it certainly wouldn't in a crisis. And as I stood there looking at the wreckage, listening to the contractors explain that they were just following HOA orders, it became painfully clear that this wasn't about safety at all. because anyone with basic sense would understand that removing a functioning bridge without replacement made the situation far more dangerous, not less. But when I contacted the HOA board directly demanding an explanation, their response was almost insulting in how casual it was. They told me to submit a formal appeal, attend the next board meeting, and present my concerns during the homeowner comment period. As if a scheduled meeting could undo thousands of dollars in damage. As if a group discussion could replace lost infrastructure, and that response revealed their mindset completely. Because they genuinely believed that their internal processes mattered more than property rights, that their votes mattered more than the law, and that I would eventually fall in line simply because they expected me to. And over the next few days, the situation worsened. Because ranch operations don't pause for HOA drama. Cattle still needed to be moved, equipment still needed to reach fields, and workers still needed safe routes. And every workaround increased costs and risk. While the HOA continued acting as if this was a minor inconvenience rather than a serious violation, and when my lawyer sent them a formal demand letter outlining the unauthorized destruction, the lack of permits, and the immediate liability they had created, the HOA's response was defensive rather than corrective, insisting they had acted in the best interest of the community, a phrase that meant nothing legally but revealed everything about their thinking. Because they had convinced themselves that the word community gave them authority over anything nearby, regardless of ownership. And it was during this that I began to notice something else, something subtle at first. Because while the HOA loved to lecture me about access, safety, and standards, their own development quietly relied on routes that crossed my land, service paths, drainage areas, and informal crossings that had never been an issue, simply because no one had ever challenged them. And once I started paying attention, it became obvious how dependent they were on access they didn't actually own. Garbage trucks, maintenance vehicles, delivery services, and even some emergency planning assumptions relied on these tolerated routes, not legally secured easements. And when surveyors confirmed that these paths were entirely on my property, not protected by recorded agreements, the dynamic began to shift. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about a bridge they destroyed. It was about a development that had been operating under assumptions rather than rights. And while I wasn't looking for revenge, I was looking for stability. Because after what they had done, I could no longer assume that cooperation would protect my operations. And as more letters arrived, accusing me of being uncooperative and threatening further action if I didn't comply with HOA demands, it became clear that their strategy was to overwhelm rather than resolve, to pressure me into rebuilding the bridge on their terms and accepting their authority retroactively. But the more they pushed, the more determined I became not to reward that behavior. Because if destroying private property resulted in control, then no landowner near an HOA would ever truly be safe. And that's when the idea began to form, slowly at first, not as retaliation, but as a permanent solution, a way to secure my land, protect my operations, and remove any ambiguity about boundaries and access. And before taking a single step, I made sure everything would be done by the book, because unlike the HOA, I wasn't interested in shortcuts or assumptions. I wanted something that would stand legally, practically, and permanently. Before doing anything that could be questioned, I slowed everything down and focused on documentation. Because one of the biggest mistakes people make when dealing with an HOA is reacting emotionally instead of strategically. And I wasn't going to give them even a single technical advantage, so I hired licensed surveyors to clearly mark property lines, engineers to assess both the damage and the surrounding land, and environmental consultants to evaluate the creek itself. Not because I wanted to build something dramatic, but because I needed a long-term defensible solution that protected my ranch regardless of how aggressive the HOA became. And as reports came back, one thing became increasingly clear. The HOA had acted without permits, without legal authority, and without understanding the downstream consequences of removing a critical access structure. And even worse for them, internal communications we later uncovered showed that board members had discussed forcing compliance by removing the bridge, which transformed what they tried to frame as a safety decision into intentional interference. And while they continued sending letters accusing me of being difficult and uncooperative, my legal team was quietly assembling a record that showed a pattern of overreach, arrogance, and disregard for property rights. And at the same time, the consultants confirmed that the creek could be legally modified within my property lines as part of approved land management, provided the work followed environmental guidelines and didn't increase flood risk downstream. Which meant that for the first time since this ordeal began, I wasn't reacting to the HOA anymore. I was planning beyond them, and that shift in mindset changed everything. Because once you stop playing defense against an HOA and start thinking in terms of permanent solutions, their leverage evaporates. And as the days passed without a bridge, The practical strain on the ranch increased, but so did the clarity of what needed to happen, because rebuilding the bridge immediately would only restore the same vulnerability that had allowed the HOA to interfere in the first place. And I couldn't risk another unauthorized action, another vote, another surprise. So instead of rushing to rebuild, I focused on securing boundaries and access in a way that removed ambiguity entirely. And when my attorney confirmed that modifying the creek within my land was not only legal, but common in agricultural land management, especially for erosion control and access protection, the plan solidified, because a reinforced water barrier would serve multiple purposes. It would manage seasonal flooding, clearly define boundaries, and eliminate informal crossings that the HOA had quietly relied on. And importantly, it would be entirely within my rights, something they couldn't vote away or dismantle without exposing themselves to even greater liability. And as soon as the permits were filed and approved, I informed the HOA through counsel that land management work would begin on my property, without detailing specifics, because they were not entitled to operational plans, and the response was immediate and panicked. Suddenly the tone of their letters changed from authoritative to concerned, asking for clarification, requesting meetings, and warning about potential impacts on their community, which was ironic considering they had shown no such concern when they destroyed my bridge. And as contractors began preliminary work along the creek, measuring, staking, and preparing the land, residents of the development started noticing activity and asking questions their board struggled to answer, because up until that point, the HOA had controlled the narrative, portraying me as a stubborn landowner refusing to comply. But now, visible action raised doubts, and those doubts would soon turn into something far more uncomfortable for them, because once construction moved beyond planning and into execution, the consequences of their decision to tear down a bridge were about to become impossible to ignore. And while they still believed they could pressure me into stopping, they didn't yet understand that this project wasn't a bluff. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't revenge. It was the logical outcome of their own actions. And it was already too late to undo. Once construction planning shifted into active execution, the HOA's confidence began to crack, because up until that point, they had relied on letters, meetings, and vague threats to maintain control. But heavy equipment doesn't respond to intimidation, and neither do permits signed by regulatory agencies. And as excavation crews began working along the creek under approved plans, it became impossible for the HOA to pretend this was just a temporary dispute, because the land itself was changing in a way that could not be reversed with a vote, and the work was methodical rather than dramatic. Widening the natural channel, reinforcing banks, managing runoff, and shaping the terrain so that water flow stayed controlled during heavy rain, all of it fully compliant with environmental requirements. But to the residents watching from behind their fences, it looked alarming, because the informal access points they had taken for granted were disappearing, and service vehicles that once crossed without issue now had to turn around, reroute, or wait for instructions. And the first real sign of panic came when emergency planning consultants hired by the HOA began raising concerns internally, because response times were changing, assumptions about access were no longer valid, and contingency plans had not accounted for the loss of tolerated routes across my land. And instead of acknowledging responsibility, the HOA reacted the only way it knew how. By escalating pressure, letters arrived accusing me of retaliation, harassment, and intentional disruption of community access, even though none of those claims held legal weight. And when my attorney responded with documentation showing permits, surveys, and environmental approvals, the HOA shifted tactics again, requesting meetings, proposing compromises, and suggesting temporary solutions, all of which carefully avoided admitting fault for destroying the bridge. And behind closed doors, board members were scrambling, because homeowners were demanding explanations, insurance carriers were asking uncomfortable questions, and contractors were refusing to make assumptions without written easements. And as construction continued, the physical reality became undeniable. The creek was no longer a shallow, easily crossed feature. It was becoming a defined barrier that followed the natural landscape and respected property boundaries in a way that left no room for interpretation. And the irony was that this project actually improved land stability and reduced erosion risk, something environmental consultants openly acknowledged. But the HOA couldn't frame it that way without admitting that their earlier claims about safety had been exaggerated at best and false at worst. And when the HOA attempted to involve local authorities by framing the situation as a neighborhood access issue, they quickly ran into the same wall of reality, because access across private land without an easement is not a right. And once officials reviewed the permits and plans, there was nothing to enforce against me. While questions about the unauthorized demolition of the bridge began resurfacing in official conversations, something the HOA had desperately hoped to avoid, and residents began noticing tangible consequences. Garbage collection schedules changed, delivery services complained, maintenance crews charged more for longer routes, and rumors started circulating that insurance premiums could increase if access concerns weren't resolved. And with every new inconvenience, the HOA's narrative lost credibility, because it was becoming increasingly obvious that this situation wasn't caused by a stubborn ranch owner. It was caused by a board that had acted recklessly and now lacked the authority to undo the damage. And while they continued sending warnings and demands, the tone had shifted completely. No longer confident or threatening, but anxious and reactive. And it was during this phase that the word moat began circulating among residents. Not because that was the technical term, but because people instinctively understood what was happening. A boundary was being enforced in a way that could not be ignored. And once that realization set in, the HOA's leverage evaporated almost overnight. Because they were no longer dealing with a theoretical dispute, they were dealing with a permanent change to the landscape that exposed the limits of their power. As the work progressed, it became impossible for the HOA to maintain their original stance without exposing themselves to serious liability, because each new phase of construction reinforced property boundaries, improved drainage, and created a controlled barrier that eliminated informal crossings, and suddenly, the conveniences they had taken for granted were no longer available. Service vehicles couldn't enter at will, emergency routes had to be reassessed, and residents began to realize the impact of the board's earlier decisions, which created an unexpected political pressure from within their own community, because homeowners started asking why the HOA had destroyed a perfectly functional bridge in the first place, why they hadn't communicated with the ranch owner, and why all of these consequences were now affecting daily life. And as internal complaints mounted, the board scrambled to craft messaging that could justify their actions. But the facts were undeniable. Every letter, every email, every contractor note showed that the bridge had been removed without authority, and legal counsel had already made it clear that any attempt to enforce compliance retroactively could open the board members up to personal liability. And with the realization that the situation had escalated beyond mere neighborhood drama, panic set in, because the HOA had relied on the assumption that I would rebuild the bridge under pressure. And now that assumption had been shattered, and as the moat took shape along the creek, it became visually obvious to anyone observing that access was no longer straightforward. And while the work itself was entirely legal and environmentally sound, it represented a permanent obstacle, one that symbolized not revenge, but the undeniable assertion of property rights. And the irony was not lost on anyone involved, because the very feature they had once labeled unsafe, unnecessary, or unsightly was now the foundation of a landscape that secured operations, protected the environment, and left no room for HOA overreach. And as contractors completed grading, reinforced banks, and finalized water flow controls, even insurance agents contacted the HOA to verify that all risk assessments were accurate, further validating the project's legitimacy. And suddenly, the HOA board found themselves caught between legal reality, homeowner dissatisfaction, and operational limitations. Unable to send workers or contractors across private property without written easements, unable to reverse the work, and facing mounting questions about liability for the original destruction. And as days passed, the narrative in the community shifted from stubborn ranch owner to HOA board. Overstepped because residents began discussing the implications openly, sharing stories about delayed deliveries, detoured services, and increased maintenance costs. And quietly, the word moat spread among neighbors, not as a literal term, but as shorthand for the new physical reality, a boundary that could not be ignored or bypassed. And in internal meetings, board members began to admit that their earlier strategy had failed, that their attempts to assert authority had created an operational and legal nightmare. And when their own legal counsel reminded them that undoing the destruction of the bridge could potentially cost the HOA tens of thousands in restitution and open them up to lawsuits, the panic became palpable, because every attempt to regain control required acknowledging fault, which they were neither prepared nor willing to do publicly. And as construction continued, the community watched, realizing that the ranch owner had not only defended his property rights but had also implemented a permanent, legally sound solution that effectively neutralized any future attempts at overreach. And while letters continued to arrive, now couched in more cautious and conciliatory language, it was clear that the HOA's authority had been permanently undermined, and the moat along the creek had become both a practical and symbolic barrier, ensuring that the board would think twice before ever attempting such interference again, because every misstep was now visible, documented, and backed by law, engineering, and environmental compliance. And the residents, initially frustrated by inconvenience, slowly began to understand that this entire situation had been the result of board overreach rather than ranch operations, which completely shifted community sentiment against the HOA, leaving the board isolated and desperate to regain credibility. In a situation that they themselves had created, by the time the final grading and reinforcements were completed along the creek, the HOA board's position had completely collapsed. Because residents were no longer blindly following their narrative, delivery and service delays had created widespread frustration. Insurance inquiries highlighted prior negligence, and internal communications proving unauthorized bridge destruction had surfaced, making it clear that any attempt to reclaim control without admitting fault would be legally and politically disastrous. And as the moat reached its final form, a controlled reinforced waterway that functioned as both an environmental management system and a boundary marker, it became obvious that this was not retaliation in the petty sense, but the logical, fully legal consequence of their own reckless actions. And when the first attempts at informal intervention failed, with letters, threats, and requests ignored in favor of lawful construction, the board realized that they had underestimated both my preparation and the legal protections surrounding the land. And suddenly, the community's perception was shifting dramatically, because homeowners could see that the board's decisions had led to inconvenience, operational disruption, and risk rather than improvement. And as questions mounted about accountability, board members began scrambling to craft messaging that could preserve face, emphasizing the legality of the construction and portraying themselves as concerned about community impact. But the facts were clear: every documented communication, every invoice, every permit, and every professional report validated my actions, and the moat, though subtle in appearance to some, was unmistakable in function, defining property lines, protecting livestock routes, ensuring environmental compliance, and eliminating any informal crossings that had previously allowed unregulated access. And as weeks passed, it became clear that the board had lost any leverage, because authority without legal grounding is meaningless, and their letters now read as cautious inquiries rather than demands, reflecting the stark reality that they could no longer dictate the outcome. And as residents observed the changes on the land, and as service providers adjusted to the new realities, it became increasingly apparent that the HOA's arrogance had backfired, because the bridge they destroyed had been the very symbol of my operational independence. And now, the moat was the symbol of law, order, and permanent boundaries, and any attempt to interfere would expose them to liability, lawsuits, and community backlash. And when board members attempted to convene emergency meetings to address concerns, residents voiced frustration over past negligence rather than ranch activity, reinforcing the fact that accountability had shifted entirely. And even casual conversations among neighbors emphasized that the ranch owner had acted within his rights, had mitigated risk, and had improved the land, while the board's decisions had only caused disruption, financial exposure, and credibility loss. And in those weeks, the HOA came to a grudging realization that power without authority, influence without law, and control without respect for property rights is a fragile illusion. And the moat, while functional, also served as a permanent reminder of the consequences of overreach. And by the end of this period, the board had effectively surrendered operational control over the disputed area, acknowledging, whether explicitly or implicitly, that any future interference would be met with immediate legal action, and that, for the first time, the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the property owner, leaving the HOA to navigate the community with caution, humility, and a clearer understanding of limits. And the ranch, now fully protected, could continue operations without further disruption. As the moat not only symbolized legal victory, but also demonstrated a strategic approach to protecting private land from organizational overreach. With the moat fully established and all legal protections firmly in place, the situation finally entered a new phase, one where the HOA could no longer manipulate events, intimidate, or make unilateral decisions without risking severe consequences, because the physical reality of the land had shifted to match legal reality, and every stakeholder could see that the property owner was prepared, organized, and acting entirely within the law. And this clarity changed the conversation dramatically, because homeowners who had initially supported the board now began questioning the wisdom of its leadership, demanding transparency, accountability, and explanations for past decisions. And as meetings and communications unfolded, the narrative shifted from the ranch as a problem to the HOA as the source of disruption, which further undermined board credibility. And as I continued to manage the ranch, operations returned to normal, but with reinforced procedures, clarified boundaries, and improved infrastructure. Because the bridge incident and subsequent moat project had revealed weaknesses that required permanent solutions. And while the HOA scrambled to regain control over public perception, the moat itself stood as a functional and symbolic safeguard, protecting livestock routes, service access, and operational corridors, while clearly defining the limits of external interference. And the irony was unmistakable, because the very feature they once called unsafe, unsightly, or unnecessary now represented stability, legality, and protection. And residents who once assumed the board was infallible began recognizing the consequences of unchecked authority, and as local contractors, service providers, and even emergency response teams adjusted to the new reality, it became clear that my planning had not only neutralized the immediate threat, but had permanently shifted operational control into the hands of the rightful property owner. And as weeks turned into months, the HOA's attempts to reassert influence were met with resistance, scrutiny, and legal pushback, because any misstep would now carry tangible liability. And the board learned a hard lesson. Authority is meaningless without law. Power is fragile when credibility is lost. And overreach inevitably invites countermeasures that are deliberate, permanent, and defensible. And this realization was reinforced by internal communications that revealed the growing frustration among residents, many of whom now privately acknowledged that the ranch owner had acted responsibly, legally, and strategically, while the board had acted recklessly. And the Moat, while appearing simpler, reinforced water barrier along a creek was in reality a multifaceted solution, managing runoff, protecting property, preserving livestock routes, enforcing boundaries, and symbolizing the unassailable position of the ranch within legal and environmental frameworks. And as time passed, the HOA's communication shifted entirely to caution and consultation, because any aggressive action could be easily documented, legally challenged, and publicly exposed, and residents having experienced both the consequences of the board's arrogance and the practical benefits of the new land management, gradually accepted the moat not as a threat, but as an essential feature that balanced private rights with community realities. And the entire episode became a case study in how assumptions of authority can be shattered when preparation, legal, knowledge, and strategic action converge. And by the end of this period, the ranch operated without further interference. The bridge's destruction was fully documented as an illegal act. Restitution had been secured, and all future operations were safeguarded by both law and physical infrastructure, leaving the HOA cautious, humbled, and fully aware that any future attempts at overreach would be met with immediate legal, operational, and community consequences. And the moat, while simple in appearance, had transformed into an enduring symbol of property rights, careful planning, and the consequences of unchecked authority. As the months unfolded, the HOA struggled to regain any semblance of authority, because the consequences of their earlier actions had created a permanent shift in both perception and reality. And the more they tried to communicate through letters, meetings, or official notices, the more obvious it became that their power was contingent on compliance from the property owner, who now controlled access, operations, and boundaries with legal and physical measures that could not be overridden. And residents began openly questioning past decisions, asking why the bridge had been destroyed, why the HOA had acted without authority, and why their own convenience had been prioritized over legality and operational necessity. And these questions were not idle, because they influenced board elections, prompted internal audits, and led to increased scrutiny from local regulators, insurance companies, and service providers. And as the board attempted to justify past actions, citing vague concerns about safety, aesthetics, and community standards, it became painfully clear that their narrative no longer held water, because every document, permit, and professional assessment confirmed that the property owner's actions had been lawful, strategic, and protective of both operations and the environment. And the moat itself became a tangible symbol of these outcomes, managing creek flow, protecting livestock routes, reinforcing boundaries, and creating a permanent barrier against unpermitted intrusion. And residents gradually began to recognize that their own well-being, property values, and daily convenience were far better served by respecting the legal limits of the HOA's authority rather than continuing to blindly support aggressive overreach. And as contractor reports, environmental assessments, and legal documentation accumulated, the ability to threaten, intimidate, or impose unilateral changes evaporated completely, leaving them to operate cautiously, reactively, and always under the scrutiny of both the community and regulatory frameworks. And while some board members attempted to downplay the situation, claim miscommunication, or request retroactive approvals, the established record was irrefutable. Every decision, delay, and complaint clearly demonstrated that overreach had led to operational disruption, legal exposure, and reputational damage. And in private meetings, Board members admitted that the initial destruction of the bridge had been reckless, poorly thought out, and legally indefensible. And while they could not openly admit fault without legal consequences, the community had already internalized the truth, which was that the property owner had acted responsibly, lawfully, and strategically to protect their operations. And as time passed, the ranch returned to full operational capacity, with livestock movement, feed deliveries, and equipment transport running efficiently. But now, with reinforced planning, clearer boundaries, and permanent legal and physical protections, and the HOA's influence over day-to-day activities was effectively neutralized, because any attempt to challenge or interfere would immediately trigger legal response, documentation, review, and potential liability. And the lessons were stark, because authority without law is hollow. Threats without enforcement are meaningless, and overreach inevitably invites countermeasures that are deliberate, permanent, and fully defensible. And as the final layer of security was implemented, including reinforced banks, water management systems, and clearly marked property boundaries, the HOA's confidence waned further. Residents accepted the practical necessity of the changes, and the ranch, fully protected by law and physical infrastructure, operated without fear of interference, while the board was left to recalibrate, learn humility, and recognize the limits of organizational power. And the Moat, though simple in design, had transformed into a multifunctional solution that safeguarded operations, maintained environmental integrity, and provided an unassailable assertion of property rights, making it clear that reckless attempts at control would now carry permanent, visible, and legal consequences. By the time all construction and legal procedures were finalized, the entire situation had reached a point of permanent resolution, because the physical, legal, and operational boundaries were now aligned in a way that could not be challenged, without immediate consequences, and the HOA's authority over the area was fully neutralized, leaving them only with symbolic oversight and no practicability to interfere. And as months passed, the community slowly internalized the lessons of the conflict, realizing that blind trust in a board's decisions without oversight could lead to disruption, legal exposure, and unnecessary conflict. And residents who had initially supported aggressive measures began acknowledging the foresight and strategic planning demonstrated by the property owner. And while some board members quietly blamed miscommunication or regulatory constraints, the facts were irrefutable, because every permit, professional report, and documented action proved that the Moat was not only legal, environmentally sound, and operationally necessary, but also a direct response to unauthorized interference that had previously threatened the ranch. And the visible changes along the creek became a daily reminder to both the HOA and residents that the balance of power is determined by law, preparation, and strategic execution, rather than votes or intimidation. And as time passed, routine operations returned to normal, with livestock movement, equipment, transport, and feed deliveries flowing efficiently, yet now fortified by infrastructure that prevented future ambiguity or unauthorized access. And the Moat, while functionally simple, represented a comprehensive safeguard, combining environmental management, operational security, and a legal assertion of property rights in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. And the HOA's letters, once aggressive and threatening, now arrived cautiously worded, reflecting an understanding that any misstep could trigger immediate legal action, public scrutiny, and reputational damage. And as residents observed these outcomes, many expressed relief that the situation had been resolved without further escalation, while privately recognizing the necessity of respecting property boundaries and the law. And the property owner, having navigated the full spectrum of conflict, from physical destruction to legal challenge, emerged not only with operational continuity, but with reinforced authority and long-term protection, demonstrating that preparation, strategic action, and adherence to law can overcome reckless overreach. And as the final months of observation concluded, it was evident that the Moat had permanently redefined the boundaries, neutralized risk, and provided a clear visual and legal message that the ranch was fully protected. The HOA's attempts at control were now constrained by law, and the community had learned a lesson about respect, boundaries, and consequences. And while the conflict had begun with the destruction of a bridge, it ended with a system that improved land management, safeguarded livestock, clarified legal authority, strengthened operational procedures, and created a permanent, defensible, and fully documented boundary, ensuring that the ranch could continue thriving without fear of interference. While the HOA, humbled by the outcome, had been forced to acknowledge limits, operational realities, and the enduring power of lawful, strategic action. And as I walked along the newly reinforced creek, observing both the practical improvements and the symbolic statement it represented, I realized that the incident had transformed the way everyone in the community understood authority, property rights, and the consequences of overreach. And in that quiet satisfaction, the final truth was clear. The bridge they tore down had been replaced by something far more resilient, permanent, and unassailable. And the ranch, now fully fortified, would remain untouchable, protected by law, strategy, and foresight for generations to come.